Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide an answer for the hope that is in them, a defense for the hope that is in them, according to 1 Peter 3:15. This time on Blessed Man Meditations, we are continuing our tour through the book by Eric Metaxas, Is Atheism Dead? Metaxas is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into 25 languages. He's the host of a nationally syndicated radio show and acclaimed conversation series, Socrates in the City. Metaxas is a prominent cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. Metaxas wrote an article that was published by the Wall Street Journal some time ago on how science increasingly makes a case for God. He's discussed much of that in probably more detail in this book, and I believe one of the appendices in this book that we're going through contains that Wall Street Journal article. So today we continue with part 3 of Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Part 3 is entitled What is Truth? This time is chapter number 28. This time it is Atheism Unhinged. That's a bit of a provocative title. It's a bit of a mysterious title. As we go through the chapter, we'll see what he means by that. There are those who take on the moniker atheist but wear it lightly, principally because they're unaware of the absurdity such a philosophy expresses, or because they don't have the courage to say otherwise and gingerly accept the label. Such souls are usually more accurately described as agnostics, but are often afraid that calling themselves agnostics might show too much sympathy for those they think of as religious fanatics. Right, if you label yourself as an agnostic, that is sometimes less maybe intimidating to a person who identifies with a belief in a God. An agnostic perhaps might be slightly less intimidating, because they haven't officially made the declaration that there is no God. The agnostic claims that they are not sure. Many of these so-called atheists prove the weaknesses of their claim to the title because they say things that sound wonderfully reasonable and therefore betray them as agnostics. In other words, there are some who might call themselves atheists, but they speak more like agnostics. For example, the paleontologist and evolutionary advocate Stephen Jay Gould had the wisdom and humility to declare, quote, "Science simply can't adjudicate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature," end quote by Gould. In other words, Gould saw the logical limits of science and admitted that science had logical limits, knowing that if there actually were a God, science would not be able to tell us much about him. And of course, today's contemporary new atheists, both living and dead, I think of Hitchens when I refer to the dead, they speak as though, particularly Dawkins speaks as though science has no limits and all knowledge has its foundation in science. And that's just, frankly, it's an ignorant statement. But those who are militant, such as Hitchens was, such as Dawkins is, such as Harris is, those who are militant in their atheism paper over such logical inadequacies. They pretend as though they're not there. They don't address them, or they figure if they do, they can just sound upset enough, and by virtue of the emotion with which they express themselves, that must mean that they're right just because they're sincere about what they're saying. They not only cannot see that science has limits, people like Dawkins, people like Harris, people like Hitchens, cannot see that science has limits, but they not only cannot see that science has limits, but preposterously claim that science is our only way of knowing anything, and further claim that the material world to which science has access is all that exists. Of course, that's an absolute truth claim, that the material world is all that exists, and they can't know that. That's like saying that because our eyes cannot smell or taste, there's no such thing as aroma or food. Sure, the eyes can't, the purview of which the eyes, the purview over which the eyes can exercise themselves does not include smell or taste, so the eyes cannot make such a declaration that there is no such thing as aroma or food. So because the agnostic or the atheist, they can't make the claim that the material world is all there is, because there's no way they can know that. There's no way they can know that. Just because there's no way that, just like with the eyes, there's no way that the eyes can smell or taste. It is, of course, perfectly circular and silly for the atheists to make these claims that science is the only way of knowing anything. They say that science can only access the material world and yet declare with the impossibility of evidence that the material world is all that has ever existed. Yeah, there's no way to demonstrate that. There's no way to demonstrate that the material world's all that ever existed. All they can do is come up with new theories, new tests, new hypotheses that will not pass the scientific method. So they will say that the material world's all that ever existed, or all that can exist, or all that will exist. And they can get dogmatic about this, and the more dogmatic they get about this, the more people believe them, and they never will be able to prove that the material world's all that exists. And the atheists will turn back on me, and they'll say, or somebody like me, and they will say, well, you can't prove that God exists. Well, in one sense, yes. I can't show you his photograph, but we have gone through much of the evidence for the existence of God and the resurrection of Christ on this channel, in the study of this book, and in other studies that I've done on this channel. So there can be a rational, logical case made for the existence of God and the truth of the Christian religion, Christianity. So Hitchens was among the loudest of these materialists, and often maintained that the scientific method and evidence were the only way to know anything. And that's just a ludicrous claim. There's no way that can be accurate, and Metaxas has gone through some of that in previous chapters in this book, that the scientific method can't be the only way to know anything. Hoping to land a wild blow against every faith and religion at once, Hitchens often declared, quote, "What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence." This aphorism was repeated so often by Hitchens' acolytes, it became known as Hitchens' razor, catapulting him into the rare shaving orbit of such as William of Ockham, after whom is named Occam's razor. The difficulty with Hitchens' razor is that it unintentionally severs the metaphorical jugular of its eponymous author, since the idea that there's nothing beyond the material world has itself been asserted without evidence, and therefore can be summarily dismissed. That sounds to me like an example of Metaxas using what Frank Turek and Norm Geisler would call the Roadrunner tactic. He is turning Hitchens' argument back on Hitchens' own statement, that Hitchens assertion can be dismissed. Metaxas says that he too, Metaxas, has an aphorism. The Metaxas aphorism is, anything Christopher Hitchens asserts must be spoken aloud in the voice of Fran Drescher. If it still doesn't seem profound, it isn't. End quote. That is the Metaxas aphorism. Metaxas acolytes have his permission to call this Metaxas's razor. In the end, it seems that the so-called new atheists and angry militant atheists have less in common with honest agnostics than with less intellectually respectable groups such as Satanists, who are obviously animated by a hatred of the God they suspect exists and the people who claim to follow him, than they are of anything more intellectually robust. Yes, it sounds, when you hear the new atheists speak, they appear to give off a, rather than a ambivalence towards a being that doesn't exist, which would be more appropriate if we were going to take the view that God doesn't exist, rather than just take a nonchalant view of not caring about this God or those who believe in him. They treat this God and the believers in this God with contempt and scorn and ridicule and mockery. And so to treat a deity or believers in this deity with this hatred or anger or bitterness or ridicule, mockery, contempt, to treat people like this seems to be demonstrative of an actual underlying belief that he does exist rather than that he doesn't. It doesn't make sense to be so hate-filled towards a non-existent being. When you hear them talk, they oftentimes sound hate-filled when they speak of the quote-unquote atrocities and the things that God supposedly endorses and advocates. The types of things that we went through when we went through Paul Copan's work, Is God a Moral Monster? The new atheists will speak with hatred and invective against the God whose scripture contains references to some of these things, and they will speak with invective against some of the atrocities committed in the name of religion. They will speak with invective against the people who believe in this God, and but yet they will say that he doesn't exist. Well, how can you have such hatred towards something that doesn't exist? It just doesn't make any sense. They seem to want to pull out all the stops to defeat their theistic enemies and are unmoored by any sense of rationality or logic. Right. Or justice or fairness or universal respect for humanity. Exactly. Because when they're attacking the theist, when they're attacking this God, they're doing so without respect for the people who believe in him and how they execute their Marshall campaigns. They don't have any rationality or logic or justice or fairness or universal respect for humanity in how they execute their Marshall campaign. So we find them sometimes making statements that reveal as much as when Hitchens once declared, quote, "I'm not even an atheist so much as I am an anti-theist. I not only maintain that all religions are versions of the same untruth," Hitchens said, "but I hold that the influence of churches and the effect of religious belief is positively harmful." And I'm sorry, but that is a ignorant statement by Christopher Hitchens. He can hold it. He's free to hold it, and others are free to hold that ignorant position that all religious belief is has a harmful effect. That's ridiculous. The Christian faith, the Christian religion, which I am reluctant to even call Christianity a religion, but to lump Christianity in with that and claim that it is harmful, that is an ignorant statement. That is somebody who does not know the truth about Christianity, about the Christ of Christianity. Hitchens couldn't bother to compare the relative harmfulness of religion to that of enforced atheism because that would be inconvenient to his point. Right? He would that would be he's being hypocritical when he says that religious belief is harmful. He's being hypocritical when he makes that claim because if he were to look at some of the things that we looked at here in Is Atheism Dead about the atrocities committed in atheistic regimes, looking at those things would be very inconvenient to the point of Christopher Hitchens. It was a kind of game for Hitchens, and to someone for whom there is no ultimate reality, what else could it be but a game? He had already told us what we needed to know to see this, that he thought of this as a mere game. The idea of truth to Hitchens was beside the point, since he didn't believe in anything like truth, in such a thing as truth. That's simply a fact, and while he might not have advertised it, since it would be bad for business, we can't think that he was unable to see it. So the rest of this quote, taken from his letters to a young contrarian, is enlightening. Quote, reviewing the false claims of religion, Hitchens says, I do not wish, as some sentimental materialists affect to wish, that they were true. I do not envy believers for their faith. I am relieved to think that the whole story is a sinister fairy tale. Life would be miserable if what the faithful affirmed was actually the case. There may be people who wish to live their lives under cradle-to-grave divine supervision, a permanent surveillance and monitoring, but I cannot imagine anything more horrible or grotesque, Hitchens says. He cannot imagine anything more horrible or grotesque than being in a relationship with the deity. Personally, I can't imagine anything more horrible or grotesque than being outside of that relationship with Christ. Of course, he's lumping the Christ of Christianity in with Allah and Buddha and all the other deities that are false deities that would not be given credence by the Christian. The Christian is agreeing partially with Hitchens in that they're not submitting to the God of the Muslims, the God of the Buddhists, but they're submitting to Christ. It seems inconceivable to a man of Hitchens' intellect that a man of Hitchens' intellect could miss the implications of his sentences. It's surprising to Metaxas to see Hitchens miss the implication of his sentences. How he writhes at the idea of God watching him is the most horrible and grotesque thing his strangely truncated imagination can fathom, and yet blithely blisters and blathers without a nod to the atheist regimes that have always done this and do this today, now even surveilling their subjects and prisoners with fabulous new technology stolen from the West or purchased from immortal Western companies whose names rhyme with Kugel, whom we must imagine would have fought hard to win the lucrative bids on manufacturing the gas chambers and crematoria of the death camps. Google rhymed with Kugel. You hadn't figured out what Metaxas was getting at. So what you have is you have atheist regimes doing horrible and grotesque things that are surveilling their subjects and prisoners and getting technology from Google to do that. And you have people who don't care about divine superintendents watching what you do on the internet. And so, but Hitchens would not have, he would not have blistered and blathered against those atheist regimes who were responsible for those types of things. Did Hitchens really imagine that a world devoid of religion would be a utopia, or did the examples from history of atheist regimes simply escape his attention in the moments he was formulating his quotable quotes? Was he conveniently omitting the facts from history that Metaxas previously cited? That as an adolescent he was taken with Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon tells us Hitchens was never aware of the satanic horrors of atheistic communism, only that at some point he was willing to overlook them. In case we haven't mentioned it, Hitchens was moving too fast ever to be very consistent, having the rare ability to proceed so hastily, whether in exhaling essays like smoke rings while under the influence of cigarettes and alcohol, or in switching topics mid-soliloquy, and keeping moving in a way that his audiences could never easily catch him in his self-contradictions or were too amused to care. His rage at things seems to have also fueled him, as though he were running from something in his subconscious too ghastly to be borne and must keep moving even at the cost of self-contradiction. In fact, it is his static sense of rage and umbrage and his endlessly affecting posture that are the only immutable and consistent aspects of his careering persona. Demonstrations of just contempt for people of faith. Those familiar with his life will see a pattern. When it suited him to be a Labarite, he was a Labarite, and when it suited him to declare himself a Trotskyite, he did. During this early period, he was of course bravely bisexual and courageously and fashionably anti-Vietnam and anti-racist and then anti-Reagan. But his habit of switching vehicles as often as possible and his escape from whatever was chasing him led him to write screeds against the Clintons and then against, of all people, Mother Teresa, whom he called the ghoul of Calcutta for her unpardonable crime of living in poverty and caring for the dying poor among the slums of her adopted city. The slums of her adopted city, probably. I'm not sure how he could find something so scathing to say about her. I mean, not to say that Mother Teresa is the picture of virtue and morality, though you will recall on this channel there is a video from Norm Geisler and Frank Turek, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. The title of that chapter is Mother Teresa versus Hitler, and the topic of that chapter is the moral argument for God's existence. And so, obviously, Mother Teresa was one who was held as one possessing virtue. Hitchens also said that Billy Graham went into the ministry to make money. As though the man who, in his nonstop writing, was not beating the bushes for hot pennies in doing so. After 9/11, Hitchens came out as unreservedly supporting the Iraq War, jigging his former leftist friends as he did so, until he finally wriggled from his last cocoon and flew to his grave in the form of an atheist butterfly who denounced all religions equally, which made as much sense as the man who hates all ideas equally. He once said, quote, "I think religion should be treated with ridicule, hatred, and contempt, and I claim that right." End quote. He claimed the right to treat religion with ridicule, hatred, and contempt. And that was obvious. You can look at old YouTube videos with Hitchens in debates and other things, and you will see him talk very just mean-spiritedly about people of religion. One can no longer ask, Quote, yes, but what do you mean by religion exactly, end quote, because the man who threw the wiffle ball of that statement has himself fluttered away to another dimension, although, of course, he would have argued that he hadn't, since none can scientifically be proven to exist. No other dimension can scientifically be proven to exist, right? Because now materialism, like Hitchens and his acolytes adhere to, this life is all there is no other dimension. So you can't ask him what he meant by that statement. While inevitably extremely less entertaining, Hitchens' fellow new atheists nonetheless offer dramatically similar logic-free bouquets of eek. Richard Dawkins said, quote, I'm utterly fed up with the respect we've been brainwashed into bestowing upon religion. So then, well, Mr. Dawkins, why should we, as people of faith, not be utterly fed up with the respect that we've been brainwashed into bestowing upon atheism? The question. I mean, we not as evolved as you are to be deserving of treatment of dignity with dignity and respect? Or, on the Christian worldview, are you, Mr. Dawkins, and you, Mr. Hitchens, you, Mr. Harris, are you created in God's image just like I'm created in God's image? And even though you don't believe in the God that created you in his image, I believe I should still treat you with respect. But yet you don't have that same moral code that you want to bother giving heed to. I mean, it's still, you are still responsible to it, and you will be judged by your failure to keep the law if your faith is not in Christ. Sam Harris declared his intention to demolish the intellectual and moral pretensions of Christianity in its most committed form. So how's that going, Mr. Harris? Are they unaware that Hitler and Himmler and Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao and Ceausescu had similar ambitions, or wouldn't that matter? Would it matter to Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris that Hitler, Himmler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, Ceausescu also desired to demolish Christianity in its most committed forms? I mean, they're sounding an awful lot like Nazis. I don't think very many atheists would be happy being associated with Nazis in their philosophy. But yet, Metaxas is claiming that their philosophy has a lot in common with the Nazis. Now, if that's true, if that's not enough to scare somebody away from atheism, I don't know what is. Because if you're not scared away from atheism, based on that claim by Metaxas, and if that claim by Metaxas is even remotely accurate, then you are in effect almost condoning the atrocities of Nazi Germany. Because he is equating some of the philosophy espoused by these notable atheists with the philosophy that undergirded Nazi Germany. But the frenzied anger the new atheists have employed in denouncing those on the other side can't help but lead to the very real demonization of their enemies. And what could be more logical? Yes. Once you have thrown away the very things given to you by the faith you've poured out with the bathwater, things like civility and respecting others and trying to move towards some actual truth, you're yourself at the mercy of the demons you've unleashed, and whether these legions are metaphorical we must leave to the careful reader. The unbridled fury on display was hardly ever well disguised as having a larger purpose than to provoke in their audiences a similar fury at their enemies. But such fury in the hands of those who've excommunicated transcendent values has nothing through which to channel the blood of their enemies, which must eventually run. Their ideological forebears are found among the French revolutionists who, in the name of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, liberty, equality, and fraternity, slaughtered their opponents like dogs in the street as the mobs roared for more, who preserved their greatest ire for priests and nuns. So the new atheists take their cue from people like the French revolutionists who came before them, who slaughtered people in the name of atheism. And we say what they did in the name of atheism because their targets were people of religion such as priests and nuns. Who but the very devil of hell could be behind something like that? And if not the devil of hell, then who? Nominations remain open, but one must wonder, what could cause people to espouse such anodyne values as this French motto publicly and vocally while they butchered innocence? Could someone live by this motto, by this philosophy, and not be bothered by it? What has history made of that other than to whitewash it and let it take on newer forms in the Bolshevik Revolution, in the Stalinist purges, in the Chinese Communist Revolution, in the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge? So these must be examples. Well, we talked about Stalin previously. We talked about the Chinese Communist Revolution previously. I don't think we talked about the Bolshevik Revolution and possibly not the Khmer Rouge. These are obviously groups that were undergirded with an atheistic philosophy that committed atrocities. If I'm understanding Metaxas right. It says much that Hitchens and Dawkins could sufficiently blind themselves to the inevitable course of their calls to arms, or would open themselves and their indisputably fine minds to the service of what look like violent spiritual forces. The so-called new atheists often used the excuse of the 9/11 attacks by Islamic madmen to launch their fusillades against all religions, and therefore sometimes against the very things attacked in those attacks, the religious and moral foundations of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Of course, those are the words from Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, and who can imagine what he or Washington might have made of these preening British pamphleteers railing against the God who commanded his followers to love your enemies? Some say Lincoln was a Christian, and so these new atheists like Dawkins and Hitchens, who lump the militant Islamic people, Muslims, who were behind the 9/11 attacks, lump them in with the Christians who say love your enemies, is just ridiculous. But that's what they're going to try to do. And then they're going to take Old Testament passages and they're going to say, look, the God that you believe in is just like these Muslims. Well, there are responses to the arguments that the atheists put forth regarding the God of the Bible and some of those troubling Old Testament passages. I invite you to check out the videos on Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan on this channel. Lincoln ended his immortal address with the following words, quote, "It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people by the people for the people shall not perish from the earth. End quote by Lincoln. It's hard not to see the new atheist sneering at the humble rail splitter's words, having already established that the God of whom he spoke does not exist. But the idea that they would put faith in Lincoln's God on equal footing with faith in the entity for whom the men flew those planes into the buildings is the sort of nonsense that can never be made sense of by anyone wishing to make sense. Right. I sort of made a point kind of along those lines that Metaxas just made on the previous slide. You can't lump the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity, in with Allah. You can't. But they do, and the New Atheist does, and that is it's a straw man, is what it is. And of course, quite sadly, it is in their calculated demonization of those with whom they differ that the New Atheists most resemble the 9/11 hijackers and other villains, recent and distant. Yes, they are acting more like verbal terrorists in some of the hate-filled things they say. Hitler's demonization of the Jews could not rest on any substantial intellectual foundations, but it didn't need to. Hitler had enough power to render those with whom he disagreed or merely disliked into soap and ashes, for he never pretended to believe in naive notions such as the equality of man or the dignity of the individual. You'll remember in a previous chapter in this book, Is Atheism Dead? You'll remember the reference to Hitler and his atheistic foundation leading him to use human flesh to make soap. Other atrocious things. He would use those ideas when it suited his purposes, would speak of the nobility of the German worker as long as it served his ends, and then would send those workers to their deaths with the same indifference that another man tied a shoe. Using human beings as cannon fodder in the services of his greater purposes was consonant with his atheist worldview, Hitler's atheist worldview. There was no transcendence and no good or evil, only power, and Hitler wanted power for himself. Did Hitchens and Dawkins ever consider how suspiciously they resembled these villains in their own reckless campaign? Yes, Metaxas is saying that Hitchens and Dawkins sound an awful lot like somebody like Hitler, with their complete just lack of respect and hatred towards people of religion. Dawkins himself wrote, quote, "My last vestige of hands-off religion respect disappeared in the smoke and choking of dust of 9/11, 2001, September 11, 2001, followed by the National Day of Prayer, when prelates and pastors did their tremendous Martin Luther King impersonation and used people of mutually incompatible faiths to hold hands, united in homage to the very force that caused the problem in the first place." Well, no, end quote by Dawkins, I wouldn't say that Martin Luther King believed in the same God that the Muslims who flew the planes into the buildings believed in. And so for Dawkins to say that the Martin Luther King impersonation that the pastors did following 9/11, that is not an accurate characterization by Dawkins. That is a caricature by Dawkins, as is common the case by Dawkins, because Dawkins is grossly mistaken when he says that it is the God that the people were praying to that was responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. No, it is the false God that the Muslims believe in, Allah. It is Allah in the Quran who advocates that type of thing. So Dawkins again is falsely representing Christianity. by lumping it in with every other religion, making it equal with every other religion, and you just do that. So where to begin unscrambling this egg, Metaxas says. Dawkins doesn't trouble himself to consider whether those motivated to murder their ideological enemies are in any way different than Jesus, who forgave his murderers. Exactly. That was what I was just getting at in the previous slide. You can't put the Muslims and the Christians in the same pot. You can't. But what is chilling about their cult of nothingness? Let's see. But what is chilling about their cult of nothingness, the atheistic cult of nothingness, is that they seem to have been willing to say nearly anything in the service of it, to throw those who beheaded Arab Christians in orange jumpsuits by the seashore, and those who believe in drowning their enemies in cages and throwing men off roofs in the very same category. That's the Muslims. What was the name of the Muslim terrorist organization that was doing those things? Unfortunately, I can't say the name of it right now. It's slipping my mind. But in this, putting them in the same category as the Amish, who publicly forgave the madman who murdered their girls, and as the African American Christians in Charleston, South Carolina, who publicly forgave the young white man who murdered their friends and family members in a Bible study after they prayed and showed him kindness. So you've got some religious people using their religion to enact violence, and you've got others using their religion to enact kindness, and you have ignorant people like Dawkins lumping the violent and the kind in the same pot. And that is just, it's wicked. It's wicked what he's doing. It's wicked. How is it that the dedicatedly persistent sloppiness of this superlatively monstrous position, bellowed by these men with innumerable academic degrees and honors, can be seen as anything but a kind of madness? It is madness. That's a great word. Even better than wickedness that I used a minute ago. It is madness. Although one needn't be apoplectic with indignation to spout such sentiments, the musician, John Lennon, was very far from the venomous hissing of the new atheists, but the banal lyrics wedded his movingly melodic song Imagine are nonetheless every bit as dull as Hitchens's razor. Though the song is infinitely more pleasant to hear than the spittle-flecked jeremiads of the new atheists, the general idea is the same. The general idea of the John Lennon song is that if we could only do away with religion, our problems would be solved. But one never gets to ask, then what? What happens if we do away with religion? But what the question, what happens if we do away with religion, is not an unimportant question. Most students of history know that when you destroy something, it may be replaced by something considerably worse. Those who got rid of the Tsarist regime had no idea that Lenin and then Stalin would usher in a nightmare that would make the Tsarist world look like very heaven. It may be that the new atheists movement in the sun has so faded in recent years because once they had taken every conceivable potshot at everything they hated several times over, they simply ran out of things to say. They found themselves in the awkward position of the dog who has caught the car and then slunk away embarrassed, having never formulated any particular plans for the car once he'd caught it. Well, that's the end of chapter 28 of Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Next time we will look at chapter 29, and we will meet some great scientists who were devout Christians. And this is significant because there are many atheists that speak as though good science can only be done apart from faith in God. And the more you actually look into that claim, the more utterly ridiculously false you see that it is. That there are plenty of great Christians, rather, plenty of great scientists who also happen to be Christians. In fact, there are some who say that it is their Christianity that allows them to be good scientists. So, we'll look at that more in depth next time. So for now, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.